Good afternoon. I'm Maureen Reedy, the President and CEO of the Paley Center for Media, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to a very special PaleyIMPACT. Today's program is made possible by the Knight Foundation, who have been valuable partners to the Paley Center for so many years. I'd like to give a warm welcome to everyone from the Knight Foundation who is watching today's program, and to offer special thanks to President and CEO Alberto Ibargüen. Thank you so very much. Never before has Paley's mission been more vital, as media has been the undisputed connector to a nation in unprecedented times. Paley is uniquely positioned to meet this moment with impactful conversations led by leaders such as our guest today, as we discuss how we can make media work for all Americans. The presentation of the Knight Foundation Gallup report is among the most highly anticipated events on the media world's calendar. Each year, it reveals important insights into American views on journalism and its vital place in our society. In many ways, the report sets the agenda for how the media industry gauges its own effectiveness and poses important questions to all journalists. In just a moment, Sam Gill, Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer of the Knight Foundation, will present some of the key findings of that report titled American Views 2020, Trust, Media, and Democracy. The presentation will be followed by an insightful conversation among some of the leading voices in journalism. Now, before we start the program, I have some brief housekeeping notes. If you're tweeting, our hashtag on Twitter is #PaleyIMPACT. Also, please mark your calendars, as we are so excited to bring you the second in this two-part series of events with the Knight Foundation next Thursday, August 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Journalism Worth Saving, What Business Model Works Best for the American People. This important conversation will explore a variety of ways that the news media can be profitable while also fulfilling its vital role to educate, inform, and make an impact. We hope you will join us again. Now on to today's program. Sam Gill oversees all of Knight's grant-making programs, community and national initiatives, journalism and arts, and he also oversees Learning and Impact, Knight's research and assessment program. Sam's presentation will be followed by a conversation among some of the most respected and influential people working in journalism today, including Jonah Goldberg, Fellow and ASNES Chair in Poverty at the American Enterprise Institute, Kathleen Kingsbury, Acting Editorial Page Editor of the New York Times, Wesley Lowery, journalist with the 60 Minutes, 60 and 6, and CBS News, Tom Rosenstiel, Executive Director at the American Press Institute, and Lauren Williams, Senior Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of Vox. Their conversation will be moderated by the Knight Foundation's Director of Journalism, Lashara Bunting. I ask you all, please join me in welcoming the Knight Foundation's Senior Vice President and Chief Program Officer, Sam Gill.
Thanks so much, Maureen. Thank you to Paley for having us. This is a really urgent conversation and a great platform for it. What I'm going to do today is just walk you through a few findings from the survey that we released this week of 20,000 Americans and their views on the media. And you can find the entire survey at kf.org. So I'm just going to fly through these findings to give you a little bit of a taste of what Americans think about the media, and then turn it over to my colleague to lead our distinguished panel. The first thing to sort of recognize is that Americans still value the news, but they don't give it a very good grade. So this is a slide showing how Americans rate the news in performing some of its most important roles. And most people think the news media, a plurality of people think the news media is doing a poor job of providing objective news reports, of making sure Americans have the knowledge they need to stay informed, and of holding leaders in politics accountable. As many of you know, some of what's driving this is sort of the intense politicization of media. So this is overall media favorability. And you can see here that while there's sort of no political ideology that has an overwhelmingly positive view of media, the gap between Democrats and Republicans is really quite pronounced. Relatively few Republicans give media any kind of favorable rating at all. There's also an age difference in the way that people perceive media, and perhaps most troubling is that 18 to 29-year-olds are actually the least likely to give news media a favorable rating, and we'll get into some of this a bit more later. Kind of the biggest trend that we saw in the survey is the way that perceptions of bias are just entirely taking over people's views on news. So this is the number of Americans who say they see a great deal or a fair amount of bias in the media. And this has been on the rise for decades, but it's now reaching sort of almost unanimous levels of Americans by the time of this survey. There is difference by party. So this is Americans who see a great deal or a fair amount of political bias in news. It gives you a sense of sort of the intensity of this emotion. And you'll see that it's much more intense among Republicans. 72% of Republicans see a great deal of bias in the media. Part of the problem is that people see bias in news stories that they believe are supposed to be objective. So 65% in 2017 of all Americans said they see it to be a major problem, that there's too much bias in reporting of news stories that's supposed to be objective. And that's now risen to 73% of Americans. So 3/4 of Americans think it's a big problem that stories that are supposed to be objective actually exhibit some level of bias. We're also seeing sort of very intense kind of attribution of animus to the media. So one of the things that we asked people in the survey was, what is it about the media that you distrust? The sources that you think are distrustful, what is it about them that makes you not trust them? 80% of Americans think they are trying to persuade people to adopt a certain viewpoint. Only 12% say they're trying to report the news accurately, but are not able to do so. So not really giving news organizations the benefit of the doubt. And then 8%, which is a small number, but it's a troubling emotion. 8% say that these news organizations they distrust are actively trying to ruin the country. So you see here that people are beginning to see the media increasingly as sort of a participant in the ideological wars in which people find themselves ensnared. People are also sort of very concerned about bias among others. So 29% are concerned that the news they get may be biased, but 69% are concerned about the news that other people are getting may be biased. So again, there's sort of this feeling that there are sides out there and that those on sort of the other side are getting inaccurate facts, inaccurate information. Again, many Americans suspect these inaccuracies to be intentional. So when asked if you see something inaccurate, what do you think is the cause of that inaccuracy? 36% of Republicans, for example, think the facts may be entirely made up by the reporter, and even 1 in 4 Democrats think that when they see inaccurate news, this may be made up by the reporter. One of the things that we probed was sort of, what is the experience of news in an era in which people are getting so much news digitally? And what we found is that people are increasingly feeling overwhelmed. And so we tried to probe, what's the source of feeling overwhelmed? And one of the top issues is actually the experience of getting news through social media. So 43% of Americans say that it's the mix of news and non-news items together on social media that's leaving them feeling overwhelmed by the news. We also tried to probe, what happens when you feel overwhelmed? We're in an environment in which we're receiving so much information passively. What happens? A plurality of people try to pick a source or two that they trust and pay attention to those sources. But 1 in 6 Americans actually just tune out the news altogether because they're feeling overwhelmed. Another big topic that we probed in the survey was sort of the question of, what a newsroom should look like. What enables the consumer to see himself or herself within the newsroom. And so we asked a number of questions about sort of the diversity of newsrooms. And one was just, do you think that news organizations should hire reporters with different backgrounds on their reporting staff? And Americans of sort of all races, education levels, of all political affiliations, sort of at a majority level thought that there should be more diversity. So a little bit lower among Republicans and independents, a little bit lower among whites, but you still have solid majorities. Where there's a real difference, however, is in the kind of diversity that's needed in newsrooms. So we asked about different kinds of diversity. One place that sort of everyone seemed to be unified was actually around for gender and age. People did not think that gender and age were priority areas in which to hire a more diverse staff. But Black Americans in particular felt that race and ethnicity was an important place. And you'll see that that's a strong contrast with whites and with Hispanics and Asians falling in the middle. And when you look at this by ideology, then you sort of see a very different picture. So by ideology, Republicans, at a majority on its face, would like to see diversity of political views within newsrooms. In stark contrast to Democrats, who also prioritize race and ethnicity as the way to increase diversity in staffs. There is some good news, however, in this survey. So more than 8 in 10 Americans still believe that the news media is critical or very important to democracy. And this is an important finding. So even as people are giving the news media sort of a poor grade in its democratic functions, they're not questioning yet that this is a vital democratic institution. Also promisingly, we saw very powerful trends about what Americans believe when they are also able to follow local news. So, for example, Americans who follow local news very closely are at an 81% rate vote that they are likely to report that they vote always or almost always, compared to 35% of Americans who do not follow local news at all. And we saw these trends play out as well across sort of other areas of civic engagement. So those who follow local news closely were more likely to feel that they knew how to get engaged in their community and make a difference. They were more likely to feel connected to the places that they lived. And they were also sort of less likely to believe that their views made no difference. They had a stronger sense of efficacy. They felt that their voice actually mattered in the democracy. So, amidst some very troubling news about the kind of bias that people are seeing in the media, the way they see the media as a participant, there are nonetheless some really important bright spots about the way that news media continues to fulfill in the minds of many Americans its vital democratic role. Again, all of these results of this survey of 20,000 Americans can be found on our website at kf.org. I would encourage you to go read the entire report. And with that, I am all too delighted to introduce my colleague, our Director of Journalism, Lashara Bunting, to lead us through a fantastic panel discussion.
Thank you, Sam. Hello, I'm Lashara Bunting, Director of Journalism at Knight Foundation. We've just learned about the findings of the 2020 Knight Gallup report on Americans' views on trust, media, and democracy. Now it is my privilege to welcome some of the most prominent voices in journalism for their own thoughts on the subject. This esteemed group will discuss their influential work and their critical role in our society. Please welcome Jonah Goldberg of the American Enterprise Institute, Kathleen Kingsbury, acting editorial page editor of the New York Times, Wesley Lowry, correspondent of 60 and 6 on Quibi, Tom Rosenstiel, executive director of the American Press Institute, and Lauren Williams, editor-in-chief of Vox. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us today. So let's dive right in. Americans' trust in media continues to decline, as my colleague Sam shared. And right now, this is a unique moment to have this conversation as we experience the story of our lifetimes between the pandemic and this fight for social justice. So let's kick off with a fundamental question here. What does objectivity mean in this current age? And is it time to redefine that? So we're going to start with Wesley and Tom here, but I encourage the group to chime in as well. Let's make this a conversation for everyone. So Wesley, you wrote about this reckoning over objectivity in a recent opinion piece for the New York Times, right? And Tom followed up with a Twitter thread, a very popular Twitter thread that offered some historical context on objectivity and some challenges to what you wrote. But I want to start with you, Wes. Talk to me about the change that you want to see in newsrooms and how that will help bridge the gap around this distrust.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the report. We should just shut up so I can go read it. But we can talk in the meantime. And I did really appreciate Tom's contribution to the conversation. I really saw what he added on to what I wrote to be complementary, not necessarily in conflict. And I think that, as I listen back to those findings, which are similar to findings that folks like Knight and Gallup roll out every year, right? Unfortunately, a lot of it is a continued march down a path, not necessarily a brand new finding, right? But one of the things that sticks out to me is that the majority of Americans, vast majority of Americans, think the media and the press is extremely important to our democracy. But they believe that the news reporting they're consuming is in some way politically biased or not. Or, it's in some way politically biased. Or they believe that the reporting that their friends and colleagues and neighbors are consuming is such, right? And that comes despite us working in industry that for those of us who worked in more traditional or mainstream newsrooms is at times obsessed with whether or not we're being perceived as biased or not, right? And so clearly something is not working in terms of how we are attempting to respond to that criticism versus what people are actually seeing, right? Now, to be clear, I don't think you can divorce that reality from the fact that we do have major, powerful people, and in fact, an entire political party in our democracy that has campaigned for decades on the fact that you should not trust us and we are biased, right? That is a real force within our politics and within our society. And so that is one of the reasons many Americans don't believe they should trust us. They're being told not to. But I do think that what's interesting to me is how that perception of bias cuts across political findings, right? That many liberals read news and news coverage and see problems in it. Many people of color read news coverage and go, this isn't true, or this is skewed this way, or this is skewed not. And so what I think is, and I guess for me, when I think about the idea of objectivity, and I think Tom described this really well, objectivity is supposed to be a process, not about the person necessarily, right? The process of objectivity is supposed to accept as a premise that no individual is unbiased. And unfortunately, I think in practice, very often in many of our newsrooms, that is a standard that ultimately leads to whomever the editor is, whomever the powerful person is in the creation of journalism, whatever they believe to be true is the objective truth, and everyone else is biased, right? It also leads to what I think is a lot of kind of bad faith of us being hung by our own rope, right? We see reporters constantly coming under attack because someone finds a tweet they sent in college once, as if proving that a reporter is a biased human should undermine their work. But again, the idea of objectivity is to suggest that every reporter does in fact have biases, right? And so I think that as we talk about these conversations, I do think we have to be willing to think about the ideas of fairness, think about the ideas of truth. We shouldn't, if there's one actor in a story who is lying, we shouldn't feel obligated to quote them in full because we do not want someone to accuse us theoretically of being biased against them. We should make our objective decisions about what is the valuable information and what is not. But beyond that, I also think that we need to steel ourselves as an industry against attacks from bad faith operators, from folks who are just hoping to undermine our work. And while trust is important, and I think I'm glad we're having this conversation, it is our job to accurately record the present and to tell the truth. And what we know about American history is the truth is very rarely popular in real time. And so I think that is also important for us to consider, that we are not politicians. Our job is not to poll low. Our job is to tell the truth.
Tom, I would love for you to weigh in here.
Well, first off, thanks, Lashara, and hello to everybody who's out there, as well as my fellow panelists. I'm the gray-haired guy on the panel. I used to be a redhead, believe it or not. I also want to say that, I directed all the media research at the Pew Research Center for 16 years, so I deeply empathize, Sam, with your reading through those results. I wrote scores of those survey questions over the years and did those kinds of presentations. I use the word empathy because actually that's one of the concepts that I think people should have in mind when they think about objectivity. So I'll try and be brief here. Objectivity migrated from social science and science into journalism in the early 20th century out of a recognition that journalists themselves could never be objective. Okay, this is the 1920s and the teens. Freud is making us aware of the unconscious and the subconscious. There was a major study in the New York Times by Walter Lippmann and Charles Mears, in which they used the term unconscious bias that distorts the coverage of the New York Times of the Russian Revolution. So this was not naivete that was slapped on here. It was the notion that because people can never be personally objective, they need to start using more disciplined, rigorous methods in their reporting and make those methods more transparent to readers and listeners. This is pre-television. Walter Lippmann talked about a more scientific spirit coming into journalism. And in science, objectivity really means replicability. If I show you how the experiment was done, and if you did it, you could then do it yourself and you would come to similar results. So it's, it's that notion. I'll just say one other thing about this. A lot of people who may be listening may have heard the term the view from nowhere, which has been popularized by my friend Jay Rosen. That actually comes from a book by a philosopher named Tom Nagel, written in 1986. In this book, Tom is actually defending objectivity as a method of understanding the world. It's objectivity as process. But the fact that Jay has popularized that term to mean that you have no consciousness, your view is almost useless because it's from nowhere. It's really the opposite of what Nagel meant. If we can get to this notion, and I'll just finish with this. There was a time, and I think it's the time when objectivity really became confused in our field. And by the way, it's confused in history. It's confused in philosophy. It's not a great term. I would like the term sort of rigorous, open, independent, rigorous inquiry, or even moral inquiry as a better term, let's say, and there may be others. But we are I think it's useful to think that we are in the era now of show me media. Show me why I should believe you. And maybe in the early, in the 20th century, when in the era of oligarchical media, you could call that the trust me era of media. Trust me because, I'm CBS News. Walter Cronkite saying, and that's the way it is. That's not good enough. CBS News has learned is a terrible phrase. Why? In what way have you learned it? Show me the evidence, and I'll decide whether I can believe you.
So this.
Yeah, you said wanted us to chime in. So I'm going to chime. Thanks for having me here and all the rest. I personally, first of all, I love that we're going to get into epistemology, which is great. But I think there are two things I want to sort of key off of. One is I think it's important for everyone to realize that while the media is in particularly bad odor and disrepute, this trend applies to virtually every significant institution in American life. Faith and trust in institutions has been plummeting across the board. I think it's been a little while since I looked at the Pew numbers, but the last time I looked, basically only the military was well above 50. The police were kind of hovering at around 50, and my hunch is lately that number is fluid. We'll just stipulate that. My colleague at AEI, Yuval Levin, he wrote this book, A Time to Build, about this basic problem. And part of his argument, which I think has important relevance for the media, is that as a culture, we are moving from an understanding of institutions as tools that form character, that you give over yourself as an individual a little bit to, for the good of the institution, and in the process, you become a better person for the purposes of that institution. And the classic example might be the Marines or the Boy Scouts, right? You go in one way, you get disciplined, you come out another way. Generations of journalists who paid their dues used to go cover, Kansas City municipal water hearings or whatever, and they learned it was the process of becoming a journalist. And we now live in a culture where we no longer view institutions as things that mold character. We view institutions as platforms to perform upon, to shine a light on ourselves and to shine our inner light in a romantic sense outwards. And you find this particularly as a problem on social media, where you have people who demand with much righteous anger that I take them seriously as non-biased, purely non-partisan, objective reporters. And then on Twitter, they unleash their ids with a fury almost matched by Donald Trump. And that becomes a real big disconnect for people. The only thing I would say is I'm not a huge fan of the disinterestedness of Walter Lippmann in the 1920s. I don't like scientism, where we take the principles of science and think we can apply them to human affairs. my working metaphor, because I'm a big defender of opinion journalism, which I think the best versions of opinion journalism are in many ways the finest forms of a journalism, because the writer puts their views out there. They try to characterize the other side's argument fairly so that they can engage with it on fair terms and have an argument. And I think democracy is about argument and disagreement, not agreement. So I always thought the better metaphor isn't from science, but from a court of law. Everyone knows that the prosecution is biased towards conviction. Everyone knows that the defense attorney is biased towards acquittal. But if the defense attorney doesn't deal with the best arguments of the other side, he's going to lose. If the prosecution doesn't deal with the best arguments from the defense, she's going to lose. And there are rules about what kind of evidence you can use. There are rules of decorum. There are obviously sort of unwritten rules about being understandable to the jury. And I think that in a lot of ways, again, we're always going to need straight bread and butter reporting. But as everything is moving in the direction of sort of opinion stuff, it is, I think, really vitally important for the people who own the label of opinion to understand that that doesn't mean you stop being fair to the other side. That doesn't mean you're, the nearest weapon to hand is available to you, even if it's a misquote or a misinterpretation. My former colleague at National Review always used to say, I want to deal with, Ramesh Ponnuru used to say, I want to deal with the left's best arguments, not their worst ones. And too much of what's happened on right-wing media, I'm the editor-in-chief of this outlet called Dispatch, and I was at National Review for 21 years. Too much of right-wing media and too much of left-wing media is this performative stuff, where people are much more interested in the most entertaining way to dunk on the enemy rather than engage with the opposition in a fair-minded way. Anyway, done.
So, Katie, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this. As editorial page editor at the Times, you recently wrote about the public interaction after the controversial opinion piece by Tom Cotton, urging the federal government to use military to put down street protests over police violence and racial injustice. And this led, of course, to the opinion editor's resignation. The opinion pages are meant to be a forum, right, for a wide variety of viewpoints and arguments, and the best arguments, right, to Jonah's point. How do you view that platform in the wake of where we're at now?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Jonah in that in my opinion, the best opinion journalism is that which acknowledges going in that it might be wrong, and that it's searching and trying to engage readers, sometimes in changing their minds, sometimes in solidifying their views, sometimes in just making them laugh or cry. But, we have an enormous privilege at the Times. Our opinion pages gets to publish essays like Wes's essay. We get to publish a huge range of views and opinions. And we do seek out every day to find the best version of those arguments. Again, all based in fact, all based in hopefully common sense for the most part. If we're really committing this dialogue, if we really believe that what our job is, as I do, is to help people come to their own opinions rather than trying to force our opinions on them, then we have an obligation to giving them a full range of opinions. And that, I think often journalists, but in particular, tend toward the binary, the left-right paradigm. Most real people don't live in a binary world. Most people have views that come from their own personal experiences and the circumstances which they're living in, as opposed to following a party line. So I really want our opinion to report to reflect that as well, and really have a range.
Have your viewpoints about the opinion pages or shifted, I think, in the ensuing months of the controversy, right? And then, I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I should start by saying James Bennett, who was the former opinion editor at the Times, is one of the most brilliant journalists I've ever had the pleasure of working with. He brought me to the Times, and he's extremely talented. and a really excellent colleague to me. And I would add, we didn't really need to change all that much after the Cotton Op-Ed. We had a lot of systems and processes in place that just simply weren't followed in the case of the Cotton Op-Ed. I think there is absolutely a version of that op-ed, I should say, that could have been published. You could have seen an argument where the senator talked through his own military experience about the training around de-escalation that could have been used to further his argument about having troops come into the streets in Washington or elsewhere in the country. But that's not what that op-ed was ultimately. I think I had a lot of issues with its tone. There were obviously issues with exaggeration of fact, context, and those types of things. In its wake, we've done a pretty thorough look at all of our systems, all of our processes. We feel like they are very strong. We are in the process of doing some hiring, and really, I think if anything, we're going to take what was an excellent operation and make it even stronger.
Great. So let's shift gears here. Most Americans are overwhelmed.
Lashara, before we shift gears, I do have to, I know I've already spoken once, but I do have to say that while I love Jonah's description of institutions and how they've changed, I struggle with the metaphor of the courtroom as a great metaphor for journalism because I'm married to a law professor, so I say this not as a lawyer, but as a spouse of a lawyer. A courtroom is set up to be a binary contest. The prosecution is there to create one outcome, and the defense is there to create another outcome. Journalism is here to inform, not to persuade to a specific outcome. And while opinion pages, can do that, the best opinion writing is actually there also to inform and not to persuade people to vote a particular way. And in that very tight and binary and tactical effort. So, and also you don't have a judge who's saying, object, who's kind of governing the situation. So, I love the courtroom metaphor. I think it has its limits in terms of being an analogy to what we are trying to do in journalism. Not to pick a fight, but
no. I generally agree that all metaphors have their limits, and you don't have beakers and Bunsen burners either in most newsrooms. The science metaphor has its limits too. My only point was that you want to make an argument that's the best argument that you can make, and you want to bring readers along with you in the argument.
I think something that gets lost sometimes is and has a lot to do with trust is whether the reporter is coming from a real place of curiosity, an openness to, the way that you went into the story not being the exact way you're going to leave the story. And I'm thinking about the two big stories that you mentioned, Lashara, COVID and the protests. And I think about official statements that journalists have relied on forever, like the official police statement being the truth, right? Or the CDC telling our entire country that masks were useless. And, all of us, my Vox included, reporting that, credulously. And then having to go back and say, well, actually masks are this, or the video came out and, the police report that we reported credulously is false. And I think that really affects trust to have to go back and forth because our, tradition has told us somehow that there is an official truth and an official path to follow. And I love that, non-traditional and traditional media is coming out of that a little more, but I do think that readers are really in tune to that, and they see things with their own eyes. They see what's happening in their communities, and when we report the opposite, they don't trust us.
Right. We lose credibility. So what do we do, right? Like, what is the solution here?
Well, actually, Lauren made me think of an example that A.G. Sulzberger, our publisher, often uses about Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who much of the New York Times reporting and others reporting shows is a war criminal. But I think it was last year we did a story. There was a convoy that was bombed. Maduro was blamed. If he had done such a thing, it would have been a war crime for sure. But the New York Times went and then used our video team to investigate and showed that actually it was the opposition, a stray munition by the opposition that blew up the convoy. And the reason why that example is powerful is because if we come out and say our reporting shows that Maduro didn't blow up that convoy, then when we do talk about him being a war criminal and we do have evidence that he is a war criminal, then I believe that the trust in that evidence is going to be higher. If that's not to exonerate Maduro in any way from the crimes that he has committed, but when we do say that the initial reporting was wrong, I think that adds to people's trust when we are saying he is committing a war crime.
So that's a great example of what I call meta narratives, which is that we get this idea in our head that George W. Bush is dumb, and then we're looking for stories that prove that meta narrative, which and all meta narratives are usually enormous oversimplifications. The guy got elected president, so he's not, that Al Gore is a liar. And when we get caught up in these meta narratives where we keep reporting essentially the same story over and over, that's another thing that I think people tune out. It's like there are a lot of meta narratives about Trump, and you think, okay, I already know this. I can read this story, but it's a new set of facts that are telling me a story I essentially already know. So it's important for us to be skeptical of our own meta narratives that we get trapped by as journalists. Well, I'll just say one other thing, that for the first about 50 years of media research, people thought that media was like a hypodermic needle, that if whatever journalists said, people would think. And in the next 50 years, media research basically found out something else, which is the media never tells people what to think. It mostly tells people what to think about. Because as you were saying, people bring their own luggage with them to the airport. They adjudicate what we tell them. So the biggest impact we have is an agenda setting impact on presenting a situation and making people think about it, but not telling them this is what it means and how you should think about it. In fact, if we get too prescriptive, they resist that.
I think it's that agenda setting piece, right, that leads people to feel this distrust, and maybe something that's setting the stage and just presenting the facts, they feel like it's a larger agenda.
Well, sure. I was going to say, I think we do play that role. Right? The reality is that in the media, we play a curatorial role. We make decisions based on a set of news values about what we write about today, what we don't write about today, and that is also an on-ramp for people to see bias or to garner mistrust, right? If the thing that is most important to me in my home, in my community, in my neighbors is something that my newspaper doesn't bother to write about, and yet something else is written about all the time, that is a form of bias. It's not this, and I think that is something that is difficult sometimes for us to grapple with as institutions or individual media organizations, because we are so understandably resistant to any suggestion that we might be structurally biased in any direction, right, in any way. No, we're not. Of course we're not. We don't make decisions. We just report the news, even though we are deciding every day what the news is and what it is not, right? And I think that there's some, push and pull to that. And that having a better sense and a better idea, and one might argue a more humble understanding of what our role is, that there are a bunch of subjective decisions being made that might allow us to be more flexible, or at least more responsive to that type of pushback, or at least be seeking it out. If we're distrusted in this space or by this set of people, why is that? And what does that mean, and what does that look like? And how do we correct that by, again, doing journalism that people value, that is important to them, that matters to them. I think that I was talking to someone earlier today, and he had asked me, do you think that concerns of bias in the media are because people don't see their viewpoints reflected? And I think that, look, I think there's a small part of that. I think it's much more about people not seeing their prioritization reflected. That you all don't care about the thing that I care about. That the emergency for me and in my life with my family is X, Y, and Z. And today you're talking about like some internet fight again, or a tweet by the press. Like that. A lot of what we are caught up in doing does not actually matter to a lot of the people who are we're ostensibly serving. And also, that's a big part of it.
No, I think that's an important point. I also think that there's a little bit of an otherworldly element to this conversation insofar as, like, I love newspapers. I love the printed word. The words matter more to me than images. I'm a words guy. That said, most Americans get their news mediated through TV. And if whatever look, as a lifelong conservative, I think liberal media bias is a real thing. I also think it's a really boring topic a lot of the time. And I get very frustrated with some of my friends on the pro-Trump right who seem to frame things as if the New York Times is running for president of the United States and therefore should be held to the same standards as the president. And to me, it's apples and oranges. It's not even apples and oranges. It's, it's forks and neutron bombs. They're just, they're different things, different tools. And that said, when you talk about meta narratives, there was a poll that came out this week from Gallup that found that 81% of African Americans in this country want the same amount of policing or more policing in their communities than they have right now. Similar numbers for Hispanics. There was shockingly lower numbers for Asian Americans, which I think is an interesting sociological thing. Now, the coverage of the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter stuff, whatever you think of whatever you think of the underlying issues, obviously there are real issues there. If you'd spent the last 8 weeks watching CNN or MSNBC, you would have no idea that a supermajority of African Americans do not, in fact, want to defund the police. And there is a certain amount of elite meritocratic tribalism on the left and the right, where these two groups of fairly well-off, affluent people from good schools are yelling at each other, and they're picking their own experts who are also from those schools, who are representing points of view to fuel narratives that are somewhat different than the actual facts on the ground. And you can get a lot of that nuance into a well-reported newspaper article. It vanishes when the host wants you give me the 3 reasons why my narrative is right and their narrative is wrong. And a lot of print journalists are paying for the sins of television journalists. And that's a mechanical issue that you guys need to figure out how to fix, because until you do, it's incredibly damning for better journalism.
Just to plus one, I think Wes's point is really important. The agenda set, there's bias in the story choices that we make. And in fact, if you look at Fox versus MSNBC and CNN, it's in story choice that you see the biggest differences, not in the way the stories are put together per se. But to Jonah's point, we're just in this situation where when I was at Pew, we did research that showed when you ask people about trust in media and then ask them what media do you have in mind, they almost always said cable news, whether they watched it or not. And so we're all in a situation where, particularly for younger folks, their model of who's a journalist is what they see on television. They've never met any of us. They've never been interviewed by a reporter. They've never been the subject of a story. Their idea is a cable host, not even really the people in the masks who are reporting on TV. And that has a deeply pernicious effect. These numbers that are in your survey, Lashara, they reflect the fact that we have had increasingly partisan media for the last 30 years. So when you look at younger people, including my kids, they grew up in an environment where most of the media that they see is partisan. So sure, they think it's biased, because the world that we live in, even of high-level opinion journalism, is not a world that they're a party to.
Well, and beyond that, not just the cable host, but it's also the person who has aggregated the story for a partisan or sneakily partisan click factory. And the reality is, media and journalism is a link shared on Facebook without necessarily much distinction in terms of where it has come from and what it looks like. And I think that and what rigor goes into it. And I think that is equally difficult for us. When we talk about, the two things, like, I think everyone here, we're all capable of a very high-minded conversation. And in fact, I think we can all critique each other's work and basically conclude that most of us do this pretty well, things considered. Right? The issue very often is it's the people or the institutions within the institution who are not here in these conversations, or who we don't actually have much power or sway over, right? That what happens tonight on CNN is going to be more influential than anything anyone on this call publishes tomorrow as it relates to American culture, right? And then how that thing is aggregated by 24 sites that I can't even name, right? But are going to be, whatever the Blue Lives Matter Facebook page says about that polling thing is going to be much more influential in American culture than my nuanced newspaper piece, or even Jonah's well-argued, opinion piece, right? Like, because 19 million people are going to read it. and I think we do have some difficulty there that is reinforced by the economic model of our industry.
Yeah, I have a small point to just reinforce that, Wes. When I was the managing editor, one of the managing editors of the Boston Globe for a bit, and I used to do this exercise whenever I took an Uber or a Lyft. I would ask the driver, "Where do you get your news?" Mostly because they were often picking me up at the Globe and they were interested in it. And they would say, "Instagram, of course." And I'd be like, "Instagram? There aren't enough words for you to actually be getting your news from Instagram." But that was real. And I think especially with young people, that is how they get their news. And so how we think about technology and platforms and how to reach people through those is really, really important.
So Lauren, I would love for you to talk about that. I mean, Vox is this incredible media organization that I think has done a really good job at trying to meet the reader where they are.
Yeah, I think a really good example of this is just YouTube. We have a completely different audience on our YouTube channel than we do anywhere else. They're younger. We have 8 million subscribers, and YouTube is just a really tough place to find truth and to find something that is real and meaningful. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done there to reach this group of people who otherwise may have been watching conspiracy theories or finding their way into some sort of radicalization, like watching a 12-minute video, even just, explaining Bernie Sanders' positions that has animation that speaks to them, a style that speaks to them, a younger person doing the voiceover has really mattered and been kind of like shockingly meaningful. I know that it's really hard to build something like that. And I know Wes mentioned, the financial realities of our industry. Video is expensive and YouTube doesn't share a lot of the money they make off of the videos. But it is really, really important. And so we're thinking about things like YouTube. We're thinking about how we're growing our Instagram, how we're taking our stories and turning them into Instagram stories, and even taking our work to podcasts has been a way to find a new and growing audience. But yeah, you can't just expect to reach people with the website.
So what's interesting about that, Lashara, is that becomes then not just an economic challenge. That's actually a democratic challenge. If we're not finding people where they are, then we're failing as journalists to create a public square.
Is it also
there are so many places where we're not. I mean, I think there are communities that don't have a daily newspaper, where maybe literacy is low, where even the written journalism or the TV journalism isn't even being consumed. Like it's almost crippling to think about how many people just aren't being served at all, and how, you know, the opportunities and challenges of getting information to people beyond, you know, just the people who watch CNN because they have cable. There's a whole country of people who aren't getting what they need from us.
And the cable and that cable connection, I mean, that's about to drop off the table in the same way that print did. So if you imagine what's the next, I mean, if Jonah's right and television and video remains the primary storytelling medium, how's that going to work in a streaming world? What is the future of television? Becomes a question that is sort of what is the future of information flow?
Of course. Well, and I think that there's a real importance as well when we think about, because again, when we think about the places that do this well, the type of journalism we would want the average American interacting with, right? Even publications that might lean a little bit this way or that way, but at the end of the day, all right, this is a thinking person can interact with this and will be better off for it. There, I think, is still some mindset that's based in old economic models, and in some ways the hubris of old economic models, where it's the news if it's in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and so you're going to buy it, and then you're going to read the news, right? That most of our magazines still pay different rates for an online piece versus if it's in the actual magazine, without necessarily acknowledging that the piece online might be the thing that goes further, that more people see. Or that in this moment, where I think a lot of people within the industry think we do have crises around civics and news literacy and access to information because of news deserts, right? What is our role in getting the best of our work as broadly and as far out there as possible? And perhaps that would make an argument for inverting that setup in some ways, right? If this is our best work, we want as many people to see it. How might we do that? And I think that a lot of our structures in legacy media, which again, I think pound for pound very often is doing a lot of that work, although I think places like Vox and other places are doing remarkable work in that space as well. So much of the legacy media thinking is still so structured in, well, but we put this on the front page. How can you say we're not covering this? What do you mean you're not? And, well, but if no one's picking up the newspaper, it becomes an irrelevant measure, or becomes a measure where you're preaching to the choir, right? If this is a vital argument, a vital piece of journalism, I want more than just the people who subscribe to the Washington Post and already read it to see it, or the New York Times Sunday Review readers to read it, right? I think that there is some question in this moment of what is our responsibility as journalists and journalism organizations and institutions to the broader ideas of media literacy, access to information, the role of media in democracy. And how do we leverage those of us who work for places that have some money, some budgets to play with? How do we put our foot on the scale in favor of more people having more information?
Yeah, I also think that, you know, I mean, the reality is, and there's good research on who is in newsrooms. And the reality is that over the last 30 years, conservatives have left newsrooms. Not that the number of liberals who've, or that newsrooms have more liberals in them, or that the people who are in them are more liberal than they used to be. What's happened is conservatives have left traditional news organizations for whatever reasons. And we're in an environment where if the country is inexplicable to us and the outcomes of our elections are inexplicable, that's a failure of journalism. That's on us that we didn't understand the country that we're supposed to report and communicate to people.
As we wrap up here, I would love for you guys just to share one quick bite. What is something that you think could be a first step for journalists, news leaders, publishers to be doing something to address these issues in the reports, issues of trust? We'll start with you, Jonah.
Well, I mean, look, I co-founded this outlet called The Dispatch. We're doing great. We just passed our 15,000th paid subscriber, about almost 8 months ahead of schedule. And what we're just simply trying to do is be honest with our readers. We're right of center, but we are not partisan water carriers. We are not trying to do party work by proxy. In many ways, sort of emotionally or psychologically, for me, a kind of model for us is the old New Republic of the late 80s, early 90s. You knew those guys were liberal, but they were willing to call BS on their own side. And they encouraged internal arguments to get at the truth. And they liked doing some reporting in the process, but you knew where they were coming from. And so that's what we're trying to do is we're still building, we're still young, and we think the best we can do for journalism is just do the best we can at that basic mission.
Kathleen, any thoughts, any closing thoughts?
I think, you know, and this was reflected in the survey findings as well, we need to continue to diversify our newsroom. And I think that we need to do that around race, ethnicity, and gender for sure, but we also need to do it around socioeconomics and making sure we have people from backgrounds from across the country, frankly, or really around the world. And, you know, as Tom was mentioning, both from a liberal background and conservative backgrounds, and really be thoughtful and considerate when we do hiring and recruiting, but also making sure that people want to stay in our newsroom and they feel like they belong there.
Absolutely.
I would say if it's one thing, Trump has set a trap for the press by saying we're the enemy of the people and we're fake news. He's trying to enrage us, and if we fall into, if we become so enraged that we confirm his accusation, we will help kill journalism from within. The future of journalism, of this kind of deeply reported, fair, open-minded moral inquiry, for that to survive, we have to win over more people of color, more young people, and more conservatives. Because right now, and you can see it in your numbers, that kind of journalism is living off of aging white liberals.
All right. Leslie, Lauren, you want to take us home?
I'll leave the last word to Lauren. But I think that, a lot of what we talked about in terms of the best of journalism is journalism that is well written, well reported, well edited, and demonstrates rigor. And I think that we have to be willing, even among the best places, sometimes to slow down, to wait. I think that everyone's got their pet list of stories that the collective we have screwed up in some way, and almost all of them can be traced sometimes to us moving too quickly. I did a big project on homicide in America 2 years ago, looking back at 60,000 homicides in major American cities. And one of the things that struck me out of that first was, frankly, the crisis in local news, that you can murder an American city and have almost no words written about it. And that is just not something that was true in prior eras of American life. But secondarily, that the vast majority of journalism is committed when the least amount of information is available. The stabbing that happens in Washington, D.C. today will be in tomorrow's Washington Post. 2 months from now, 3 months from now, when there is a full trial and all of the information is available and we know who all the people are and who the victim was and what happened, there very likely won't be a word written about it. And that becomes very difficult. We never get to the end of some of these stories because we're so quickly moving to the next one. Even today, as we talked about our cable conversation, there are cities across the country engaged in complex processes to figure out how they might reform their police departments. These fascinating, nuanced stories, meetings that are happening. It won't be on television tonight, right? That we had all of the conversation and all of the coverage in the moment of what felt like urgency, and then that gave way to what will be months of work and discussion and debate. And unfortunately, there will be exceptions, but the exceptions will prove the rule. We will all read one really good piece about how one place tried to do this, and we will very likely not read very much at a national level about all of the work happening elsewhere. And so again, I think that when possible, and again, this is even true of the biggest places, the best places doing the best journalism, is pausing, calming ourselves down, making a few phone calls, waiting a week till we get those records or those documents, because nothing hurts us more than being wrong.
Absolutely.
I'll be very quick. I think as journalists, we need to continue to remain open and curious when we're approaching stories, particularly complicated ones. I think we need to do a better job showing our work to the audience and admitting when we're wrong.
Couldn't have said it better. Thank you for joining us for this Paley Impact event. Thanks again for the support of the Knight Foundation. You can catch the full report at kf.org. Be sure to support the Paley Center and consider becoming a Paley member by visiting paleycenter.org. Take care.